You're brushing your teeth on a random Tuesday, 3 days after the argument ended, and suddenly you're back in it. You're delivering the perfect comeback you didn't think of in the moment. You're replaying their exact words, the tone, the pause before they said the thing that stung. The fight is over. Nobody won. And yet some part of your brain is still standing in that room, running the scene again, like it's waiting for a different ending. That's strange, isn't it? The argument is done. There's nothing left to decide. So why won't your mind let it go? Here's the part almost nobody realizes. Your brain isn't replaying the argument because it's broken. It's replaying the argument because, as far as your brain is concerned, the argument was never actually finished. The psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik discovered something unexpected back in the 1920s, watching waiters in a Vienna cafe. She noticed the waiters could recall complicated, unpaid orders in perfect detail, but the moment a bill was settled, the details vanished from memory almost instantly. Zeigarnik went on to test this formally, and found that people remember interrupted or incomplete tasks far better than completed ones. Your brain, it turns out, treats an unfinished task like an open file it can't close. It keeps a small amount of mental resources tied up in it, quietly, in the background, refusing to let the memory settle until the task feels resolved. This became known as the Zeigarnik effect, and it explains far more about your replaying mind than you'd expect. An argument, especially one that ends badly, is the emotional equivalent of an unpaid bill. Nobody apologized cleanly. Nobody got to say the thing they actually meant, the thing that would have landed if only they'd found the right words in time. The conversation stopped, but it didn't resolve. And your brain, following the exact same rule Zeigarnik found in that cafe, keeps the file open. It doesn't know the difference between an unfinished grocery list and an unfinished emotional exchange. Both register as incomplete. Both get flagged for replay. Think about what a typical replay actually looks like from the inside. You're doing something completely unrelated, driving, folding laundry, standing in the shower, and the argument surfaces uninvited. You don't decide to think about it. It simply arrives, fully formed, as if a switch flipped somewhere below conscious awareness. Within seconds you're not just remembering, you're reliving, hearing the exact inflection of their voice, feeling the same tightness in your chest you felt in the original moment. Your heart rate can climb slightly. Your jaw might clench. Your body doesn't seem to know that the argument ended days ago. It responds as though the confrontation is happening again, right now, in real time. That's because, physiologically, it partly is. The replay isn't a cool, distant memory review. It's a reactivation of the same emotional circuitry that fired during the original event, which is part of why a 3-day-old argument can still make your hands shake a little while you're standing at the sink. So why does the replay feel so specific, so detailed, almost cinematic? Because your brain isn't randomly recalling the argument. It's actively trying to solve it. Think about what you're usually doing during those replays. You're not just remembering what happened. You're rewriting it. You're finding the sentence you should have said. You're imagining their face if you'd said it. You're running simulation after simulation, searching for the version of the conversation that would have ended differently. This isn't a malfunction. It's your brain treating the argument like an unsolved problem, and problems are exactly the kind of thing your mind is built to keep working on, whether you consciously choose to or not. Here's where it gets more specific. The psychologist Nolen-Hoeksema spent decades studying what happens when this replaying becomes a pattern rather than a passing moment. She called it rumination, the tendency to fixate repeatedly on the causes and consequences of a distressing experience instead of moving toward resolving it. Nolen-Hoeksema's research found something important. Rumination doesn't actually help people process what happened. It doesn't produce new insight or closure the way people expect it to. Instead, it tends to deepen the emotional charge of the memory, making the argument feel just as raw on the 5th replay as it did on the 1st, sometimes worse. The Zeigarnik effect opens the file. Rumination is what happens when you keep reopening it without ever actually closing it. There's also a strange specificity to which arguments get stuck like this and which ones fade quickly. A minor disagreement about where to eat dinner rarely earns a 3-day replay loop. But an argument that touched something you actually care about, being taken seriously, being trusted, being treated fairly, tends to loop far longer, because the stakes attached to it are higher and the sense of unfinished business runs deeper. It's not really the argument itself that determines how long the file stays open. It's how much the outcome mattered to you, and how far the ending felt from anything close to resolved. So if replaying doesn't help, why does it feel so compulsive, like you can't simply choose to stop? Because on some level, it feels productive. Each replay carries the promise that this time, you'll figure out the perfect response, and once you do, surely the tension will finally dissolve. But there's a cruel design flaw hiding in that promise. The perfect comeback, discovered 3 days later in front of a bathroom mirror, can never actually be delivered. The moment it would have mattered is gone. So the mental rehearsal completes a fantasy version of the conversation, one that never touches the real, unfinished one sitting in the world. Your brain gets the temporary satisfaction of a solved puzzle, and then, almost immediately, remembers that nothing has actually changed. The real argument is still sitting there, unresolved, and the file reopens again. There's a specific reason arguments get stuck in this loop more than almost anything else in daily life. Most incomplete tasks have a clear finish line. You can pay the bill. You can send the email. You can finish the report. An argument with someone you care about rarely offers that same clean endpoint, because resolving it depends on another person, someone whose reaction you can't fully predict or control. You can't finish the task alone, the way you closed out a grocery list or a work assignment. You need their participation to close the file, and until that happens, or until you find some other way to make peace with it, your brain treats the whole thing as permanently, maddeningly open. Here's the twist that makes this even harder to shake off. The replaying doesn't just fail to help, it can actively make the wound feel fresh again and again. The researcher James Pennebaker spent years studying what happens when people process emotionally significant experiences, particularly through writing about them in detail. Pennebaker's work found that structured, reflective processing, actually working through what happened and why it mattered, tended to reduce the emotional grip of a difficult memory over time. But that's a different mechanism entirely from the loop most people fall into after an argument. Simply replaying the scene on autopilot, without genuinely working through the meaning behind it, doesn't get you the same benefit. It's the difference between writing a letter you never intend to send and reading the same unresolved paragraph over and over, hoping it will eventually make sense on its own. So what is actually happening inside you during one of these late-night replays? Zeigarnik's open file is sitting there, tagged as unfinished business. Nolen-Hoeksema's rumination pattern is running the same scene on a loop, convinced each pass might finally produce resolution. And because the resolution depends on a person who isn't in the room with you, the loop has no natural exit ramp. You're essentially trying to close a door that only opens from the other side, using a key that was never going to fit in the first place. This explains something that trips a lot of people up, the fact that the replays often get worse before they get better. You might expect the 10th replay to feel calmer than the first, the way retelling an old story eventually loses its sting. But rumination doesn't work like ordinary memory. Each replay can reinforce the same emotional pathway, strengthening the groove instead of wearing it down, especially if every version ends with the same unresolved ache. This is part of why people can find themselves angrier about an argument on day 4 than they were on day 1, even though, rationally, nothing new has happened since the original conversation ended. There's another layer worth naming here. Certain small triggers can reopen the file even when you thought you'd finally set it down, a similar tone of voice from someone else, a phrase that echoes what they said, even just standing in the same room where the argument happened. Zeigarnik's open file effect doesn't just sit passively waiting. It's primed to reactivate the moment something in your environment resembles the unfinished business it's still holding onto. That's often why an argument can feel settled for a week and then resurface out of nowhere after a completely unrelated conversation happens to brush against the same nerve. Knowing this changes what you do with it. The replaying isn't proof that you're overly sensitive, or that you can't let things go the way other people supposedly can. It's your brain running an old, well-documented filing system, the same one Zeigarnik found in a Vienna cafe 100 years ago, applied to a kind of unfinished business it was never perfectly designed to handle. You can't force the other person to give you the clean ending your brain is searching for. But you can give the file something closer to closure yourself, writing out what actually happened and what you wish you'd said, not to rehearse it forever, but to finally put it down on a page instead of carrying it around in your head. You can name, specifically, what would actually resolve it for you, rather than replaying an infinite loop of imagined comebacks that were never going to be delivered anyway. Sometimes the file doesn't get to close the way you want. But you can still choose to stop reopening it every night. You're brushing your teeth on a random Tuesday, and the argument is still there, uninvited, running one more time in your head. Now you know why. It was never really about winning the fight. It was an old filing system, doing exactly what it was built to do, still waiting for a door that only someone else can open.